There's a long history associated with the schooner races. It goes way back to the early 1900s. And of course, the rivalry was intense when fishing on the banks because the Nova Scotian vessels only had to travel out 50, 60 miles, and they were on the fishing banks. The Gloucester vessels had to travel 300, 400, 500 miles, 1,000 miles to get to the Grand Banks. So they needed to be sleeker and faster in comparison because they had to make market. When the competition started up, these same Canadians in Gloucester, now newly minted U.S. citizens, were really sailing in competition against their uncles and fathers and grandfathers down in Nova Scotia. So it was like one big family, except for the competitive part, and they weren't to be outdone in Nova Scotia by any of their grandsons or sons in the United States.
The International Fishermen's Races started formally in October of 1920. The Halifax Herald challenged Gloucester's fishermen to a race between our nation's fastest schooner to be selected and their recognized Canadian champion, the Delawana. The rules stipulated the boats would be powered by wind alone. Auxiliary engines could not be aboard.
By that time, the diesel engine and power had entered the fleet as early as 1900, so by 1920, many vessels had installed auxiliary power. There were few all-sailing schooners to compete in this invitation that was extended by the Halifax Herald. Just about that time, in October, the ESPERANTO, a vessel built in Essex in 1906, designed by Thomas F. McManus, was coming in from a saltfish trip. She was an all-sail vessel with no auxiliary engine, and she had a reputation of being a flying fisherman.
Extensive repairs and a glistening paint job were hastily performed, and on October 25th, Esperanto proudly sailed for Halifax, Nova Scotia, as thousands of Gloucesterites lined the wharves, cheering her on to victory. Captain Marty Welch was in command of a hand-picked crew of some of the most able men out of Gloucester. Esperanto won both races, a $4,000 cash purse, and the first International Fisherman's Trophy.
And the Dennis Cup from the Mr. Dennis of the Halifax Herald was stowed in the fish hole, and the Gloucester vessel Esperanto left with a brand new broom lashed to her masthead and the fore topmast, and she was bound for Gloucester. When she arrived at the telegraph office on the corner of Middle Street and Pleasant Street, still standing, the ticket tape was up above, and my dad told me 100, 200 people were outside. Traffic couldn't get up and down Pleasant Street, hossing teams in those days, because of the crowd that was gathered outside of the telegraph office. It was a grand and glorious time. That started it all. The next year, the Esperanto went aground on Sable Island Bar, the Northwest Bar, and she was a total loss. The Nova Scotians, recognizing that they needed a faster vessel, designed and built the famous BLUENOSE. Gloucester was without a contender.
Angus J. Walters of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, had been a fisherman since the age of 14 and a schooner captain at 23. He gained local fame for the speed at which he could bring a boatload of fish to market. Having missed the first international schooner race in 1920 after breaking a mast in a qualifying race, he was game to compete. Walters was a Freemason, as were members of the newly formed race committee. They had commissioned Halifax marine architect William J. Rue to design an ultimate schooner specifically for the purpose of winning the international races. They asked Angus Walters to be its captain, and the BLUENOSE would become the most famous ship in Canadian history, its image engraved on every Canadian dime since 1937. With the sinking of the Esperanto just a few months prior, the Bluenose easily won its first competition against Gloucester's replacement, the smaller ELSIE, in 1921.
Along came a vessel called the Puritan, designed for racing. She was a beautiful vessel, probably the fastest vessel that ever sailed from the city of Gloucester, in command of Captain Jeff Thomas, famous for his vessel, the Adventure, which is in Gloucester to this date. Jeff Thomas was at the wheel, and she sailed fishing in 1922.
Ben Pine had risen to prominence among the Canadian-born fishermen who dominated the Gloucester waterfront in the 1920s. Pine's relationship with the Puritan was aptly described by Mark de Villiers in his 2009 book, Witch in the Wind. The public face of the Puritan was a well-known Gloucester fishing skipper, Jeff Thomas. But the real driving force was Ben Pine, a Newfoundlander who had built a Gloucester junk business into a formidable fishing fleet. Pine was a bluff man with equal amounts of charm and ruthlessness. He was known for his charity to indigent seamen and lost boys on the wharves of his adopted city, but also as a man who didn't scruple to bankrupt his opponents. He moved easily between the working fisherman himself — he'd been to sea, though never as a working man — but he loved the life and was caught up in the romance of the races.
The vessel lasted just 3 months. She was so fast that in the fog he overshot his mark, and the vessel went ashore on the northwest bar of Sable Island, across the bar into the ocean beyond, and a total loss. Now what to do? What should they do? Well, time went on, and finally they built the Columbia. Just a shade smaller, a few feet shorter than the famous Puritan. She was the last salt banker dory trawler to be launched out of Essex without auxiliary power. She did not have a shaft log. She did not have any provision for having diesel power installed. She was a total, authentic, sail-carrying schooner. She was designed with the fishermen's races in mind. Ben Pine himself and 4 or 5 other businessmen, and they put together the money and the investment in the Columbia. I might say that of all the vessels that Ben Pine owned and managed over the years, maybe 50, maybe even 75, very few of those vessels did he own outright. He always had shares in seed money. He was the one that promoted and secured the financing, but he did it with many others. His money was not always at risk.
The Columbia easily won the qualifying rounds off Gloucester to compete in the 1926 race, and made it to Halifax just in time to begin the competition. The 2 boats and crew were so evenly matched, the Bluenose beat the Columbia by only 50 seconds in the first race, and by 90 seconds in the second race. But the race committee gave Columbia the second round, as the Bluenose passed a buoy on the wrong side, a rule that had been instituted the night before. Angus Walters, claiming not to have known about the rule change, was never one to appreciate fussy race rules. To him, the whole point of a race was to be first across the finish line. Incensed with losing by a technicality, he declined to race the third round. With the Bluenose now disqualified, the race committee told Ben Pine if he sailed the third race himself, he could take home the cup. Ben's answer is the stuff of legend. "I came here to race the Bluenose," he said, "not to go for a sail." And with that, he returned to Gloucester without the prize. With the race forfeit by both sides, the purse was split in half, and the Bluenose remained undefeated.
Angus Walters was a cantankerous old fuddy-duddy. He was a poor loser, if anything else, and he would walk away. Ben Pine was a sportsman. They had a rivalry, and Ben Pine was right there when the time came to fight over every inch of waterway that they competed against. Angus Walters was a grumpy guy, but he was a great fisherman, and he was a even greater sail handler. And he had probably the best boat that ever sailed the Atlantic in international fishermen's races. Ben Pine considered the Columbia the finest piece of wood that ever sailed around Eastern Point. It's the Columbia image that's on his tombstone in Oak Grove Cemetery in Gloucester, facing Washington Street for all to see. The Columbia was really his pride and joy. He did not prevail. The Columbia did not take any series in her lifetime. Unfortunately, the Columbia was sunk on August 24th, 1927, in the Great August Gale, when 8 or 10 Nova Scotian vessels and the Columbia were anchored off of Sable Island, and a hurricane came down, and all these vessels were lost. The Columbia went down with all hands, including a 17-year-old young boy. So here we are without a contender. This is in 1927. 2 years went by, and Piney conceived the idea of the Gertrude L. Tebow.
When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Gloucester's last great challenger was being constructed in the Essex shipyard. Having been financed by a syndicate that included the New Jersey millionaire and Eastern Point resident Louis A. Tebow, the Gertrude L. Tebow was locally considered a harbinger of good fortune. Designed by the Bostonian naval architect Frank Payne, she was built and outfitted at a cost of nearly $80,000, making her the most expensive fishing schooner ever made, although clearly her sole purpose was to win races.
Ben Pine convinced a half a dozen processing firms, men prominent in the fishing industry, to contribute $5,000 apiece. With that seed money, he went to a financier on Eastern Point, Louis A. Tebow. He himself probably suffered great losses during the 1929 crash, but he was a racing enthusiast. He convinced Louis Tebow to invest $40,000 in a contender for the International Fisherman's Cup. His wife, Gertrude L., contributed $10,000. On March 17, 1930, the Gertrude L. Tebow was launched with great fanfare in Essex. This vessel, while she had to be a bona fide fisherman, was really built to be an international contender and take the cup away from the BLUENOSE.
She was launched in time to qualify for the 1930 Lipton Cup races off Gloucester, which the media-savvy Pine helped cook up as part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's 300th anniversary celebration. Angus Walters, still steamed about the events of 1926, played hard to get and cited the need for costly repairs they couldn't afford. Ben, ever the consummate promoter, most likely was committed to the race on many levels. Not taking no for an answer, he came up with the $10,000 the BLUENOSE needed for retrofitting and sealed the deal. The BLUENOSE, showing her age, lost the first round and was leading in the second race when the weather worsened, causing the race to be canceled for lack of visibility. Angus was furious with the race committee. On the next attempt a few days later, he made a rare navigational error, allowing the Tebow to take the prize. Angus took personal responsibility for the loss, but would not allow blame to sully the BLUENOSE, saying, "The Tebow didn't beat BLUENOSE, she beat me." As this was not an official race between the U.S. and Canada, the loss meant nothing to the Lunenburgers, who continued to claim the BLUENOSE was undefeated. By 1937, the popularity of the MGM film Captains Courageous would put Gloucester in the spotlight as the nation embraced the film's nostalgic and overly sentimental view of schooners and dory boat fishing. Eager to capitalize on this, the Master Mariners Association sent Ben Pine to Halifax to renew the international fishermen's races, this time as a best-in-5 challenge off Boston and Gloucester. To Angus Walters, by now in his 50s, it was a hard sell. He wanted to move on from fishing. Besides, his wife had died, and he was getting ready to marry a former Halifax barmaid still in her 20s. The BLUENOSE was 18 years old and again would need at least $10,000 worth of rehabbing, money that wouldn't be coming out of his pocket. Ben Pine leaned on Boston friends and raised $8,000. This turned out to be enough to motivate Nova Scotians to come up with the rest. On October 6th, the BLUENOSE docked in Gloucester. On board were 40 tons of ballast in the form of pig iron bars, which would be used to compensate for the weight of the engines, blocking, shafts, and bearings after removal. Once in Gloucester, each race boat was trimmed by adding or removing ballast so their water lines met the approval of the race committee. The rules stated that once the water lines were approved, no ballast could be added or reduced until the final race was over. Depending on wind conditions, more or less weight could allow the BLUENOSE to handle better, so not being fond of race committee regulations, Walters quietly moved iron in and out of the schooner in the dead of night, depending on conditions predicted for race day. Sensing this might be the case, Ben Pine's partner, Miss Ray Adams, never one to mess with, hired a security guard to discreetly monitor the wharf overnight. She ultimately caught them red-handed, and the details hit the papers. Amazingly, the race committee decided not to penalize the BLUENOSE. They were probably worried Walters would sail away in a huff, as he had been bitterly complaining about the conduct of the race committee for weeks. They also weren't ready to squander the media frenzy, which had built up the match to Herculean proportions. And so it was that the Gertrude L. Thibault and the BLUENOSE each took 2 races and were tied, when the 5th and final race was held that October of 1938. It was finally the moment that Gloucester had been waiting for since 1921. A health flare-up put Ben Pine in the hospital after the second race.
Ben Pine was not in good health. He turned the command over to his best friend, Captain Cecil Moulton, and it was Cecil Moulton that competed with the BLUENOSE in the remaining races, and the BLUENOSE won.
18-year-old masked headsman and future Hollywood movie star Sterling Hayden worked high aloft and distinguished himself by inching out on a spar to secure a loose block, a deed described as heroic in the following day's newspaper accounts. In breezes that Ben Pine complained were so light you could have paddled a canoe around the course, the BLUENOSE won the final race by less than 3 minutes after sailing 35.5 miles. Insults were thrown from both sides. Moulton cited the illegal movement of the ballast. Angus complained the Thibault carried too much sail. Both crews complained about the lack of wind, but when the time came to present the Halifax Cup, it was nowhere to be found. Days later, it showed up at an orphanage, the New England Home for Little Wanderers, with a poem attached. It read,
"Here's to Angus, good old sport, whose challenge sort of takes us short. Send us a gale that blows at 30, and we'd bet our shirts on little Gertie."
It is perhaps sad that races intended to be a test of skill and goodwill between the nations ultimately accomplished neither of those things. But although the Halifax Cup would continue to live in Lunenburg, Gloucester would forever cherish those 2 races when their beloved Gertie left Angus Walters and the mighty BLUENOSE in its wake.